All right, we are continuing in the Sermon on the Mount. We started a couple weeks ago in probably the most well-known sermon in all of history. And we looked at the introduction. Every sermon has an introduction, and Jesus is the same way. And so in the introduction, you have the things like the Beatitudes and salt and light. And Jesus makes this point. And we raised the question, when is doing a good thing not necessarily good? And we saw if it doesn't come from a heart that is devoted to God, that's pure in heart, then good things can actually end up having a bad effect. And certainly they can miss out on their intended effect of bringing glory to God. So he starts with that. We need to do good deeds out of a true heart commitment. Well, last week, then, we looked at some of the specific good deeds that we should be doing as Christians. And we saw this idea that we need to not only live above the world, because sometimes we use that as a standard, and you can always find someone who's not doing as well as you and say, all right, well, that's my standard. I must be doing okay. I'll just stop here. And Jesus makes the point, remember, he says, be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's our standard. And God knows we're never going to live up to it, but he says that's what you shoot for. What else would you do? Try to be half as perfect as God? No. That's what we look at. Live by that standard of God's righteousness, his principles for living. Well, then right after that, Jesus realizes that, boy, these humans, I love you guys, but you can go to the opposite extreme too. And so look at the warning he gives in chapter 6, verse 1. He says, be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Now, righteousness, again, it's this idea righteous means to conform to God's standards. And so that's what he was saying before in this part we looked at last week. Here is God's standards for righteous living, for holy, godly living. And he says, I want you to live by them. But then he comes over here and says, but I don't want you to do these things, these Christian acts, these acts of a disciple, to get attention from people. Because I know that you can do that. I know it's a human tendency sometimes. It's a big one. And so he's going to talk about this for a while. And the thing that really stands out, and I think it sort of qualifies as a little bit of a wait a minute moment, he says, if you do your righteousness to be seen by people, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. Of course, the other side of that means, okay, if I don't do them to be seen by people, that must mean I do get some reward from God. And the central question today is, what reward does God want to give us? What reward? The word comes up 7 times in the first 18 verses. Sometimes it's God saying, if you do your righteousness to be seen by men, that's the only reward. But then he ends each one and says, but if you don't, you get a reward from God. And so it raises that question. What is that reward? I'm sort of interested in that. One thing he's not talking about salvation. Again, this is written to disciples, people who are saved, forgiven, going to heaven. So he's not talking about that. And I don't think he's just talking about something that's going to happen later in heaven. There is something that's going to happen here in this life that God wants to give us. What reward does God want to give us? Well, let's look at what he has to say about this. Start in verse 2. He's going to look at a few different things, specific acts of, again, Christians and disciples. He says in verse 2, so when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. Now, the giving in their day, a big part of that was specifically giving to meet the needs of other people. Again, God's people. They were all in the land of Israel, all Jews, all God's people. And so part of their giving was specifically, to meet the needs. And it's still something that happens today, a little differently maybe, the way we do it in the church. Sometimes it's direct, one person to the other. But part of every church life should be to take care of people in the church family. And matter of fact, if you're not familiar, when the money comes into Transforming Life Christian Church, the first 10% goes to missions, to people, to some godly cause that, that's away from us, that doesn't have a direct connection to us, and ours specifically is an orphanage in Mexico. The next 10% goes to benevolence. That's to help with needs that arise here within our church family. And so, again, that principle, we do it a little different, but it's the same thing. When you give to the needy, he says, don't announce it with trumpets. Now, I looked at, and no one's really sure what that means. They're not sure if, were people like really blowing trumpets saying, look at my giving. Doesn't seem like they had their own personal trumpet and they were doing that. but that'd be really over the top. But it does seem that there were fasting days that would be announced with trumpets, and so everyone's attention was there, and maybe some people gave in connection with that. Like, now that everyone's looking, now is when I'm going to give to the needy. So whatever it was, it's the idea of people specifically seeking the attention of other people. And he says, don't do that. Don't announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do. Again, and he says in the synagogues and on the streets. So when they gathered together for their Sabbath, their Saturday worship, and also just throughout the week as they're going about, always looking for attention. And that word hypocrites, it means an actor, initially, but it came to have a negative connotation. It wasn't just someone playing a role, without any moral connotation. It came to be someone who's pretending to be something they're not. That's what a hypocrite is. Pretending to be something on the outside that they know they're not on the inside. And look what it says. It doesn't say as a hypocrite may do. He says as the hypocrites do. And that tells me they knew people like this. They knew there's a whole group of people like this. As a matter of fact, some Jewish literature talks about it, even apart from Jesus warning against this. So it means it was a pretty big problem of people wanting this attention like that. And Jesus says, if you're doing it to be honored by others, truly I tell you, they've received their reward in full. That's what they get, is the attention of men. Verse 3, he says, but when you give to the needy, so notice in all these, he's not saying don't do these things, but he's saying when you do them, I expect you to do them. Do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Now, is that literally possible, to not let your left hand know? No, and Jesus does it. It's a little bit like last time. You gouge out your right eye. He's not looking for us to gouge out an eye, but he's trying to make a point. This is how serious it is. This is the extent to which I want you to take this. Give in secret. Don't look for attention from men. He says that in verse 4. So that your giving may be in secret, then your Father, who sees what is done in secret. You don't have to announce it for God to know. He will reward you. So there's that idea. God is going to reward us for this. What is it? Well, he goes on and he talks about another thing that disciples should be doing. He says in verse 5, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Same type of thing. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So once again, does that mean anytime you pray, you've got to be in a room with the door closed? No, he's just trying to make the point. Don't look for others to notice you. Don't make a point of that. Now, I'm going to skip over the next several verses because now that he gets on the subject of prayer, Jesus gives what is often called the Lord's Prayer. I said it's better a model prayer. And there's so much there, we're going to look at that next week. Because, there's way more than we could do today. And also, you can tell, if you skip down to verse 16, he continues this same thought. He gets a little, I'm saying Jesus gets off track, but he focuses on prayer for a while, but then he comes back to the third thing, and you can see the same format. He says in verse 16, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show that they are fasting. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward in full. Now, fasting, in Jesus' day, it was the idea of not eating for a period of time. And some people, when they would do that, as he's saying, they wanted others to know they weren't doing that. They wanted to know just how much they were sacrificing and suffering for God. So they'd look different. They'd do things. They wouldn't comb their hair, keep it neat, and like, oh, well, I'm doing this for God. Well, not really. To do that, it means they want the attention of other people. And Jesus says that's all the reward they're going to get if that's what you're seeking. But look what he does say in verse 17. He says, but when you fast, and right there we need to stop, because that's saying just as much as he expects Christians to give to the needy, and just as much as he expects Christians to pray, he's saying, I expect Christians to fast sometimes. And that's something we don't often do, maybe don't often talk about. But it's something that's important. Fasting, in essence, again, when you're not doing it the way some of the hypocrites were doing it to be noticed by men, fasting has a couple purposes. First of all, it's to discipline yourself. Eating is one of the most basic needs that we have. And if we can put that off for a while, that discipline in that area transfers to other areas of life. Anything like that carries over. And so if you can do it in this area, it makes it easier to be more disciplined in other areas. The other thing about fasting is it shows, and you see this in the Bible at times, it shows the seriousness of a situation. You know, when we're in the middle of maybe a very serious situation, aren't there times when we don't eat at all? We just have no appetite. We don't eat. Well, that's sort of the idea here. You know, it just doesn't make sense. God, I'm very concerned about this. Please work. Hey, could you pass the pie over here? It's the idea, I'm so serious about this. As I pray to you, God, I'm going to put aside this other need because this need is more important at the moment. And again, in Jesus' day, fasting was almost entirely just focused on food. In our day, certainly that can be one element of it, but I think there's other things as well that can show just as much discipline. And I'm not saying don't fast from food. I think that's a good thing. Now, one thing, it doesn't have to be a whole day. You know, oftentimes I'll fast for breakfast and lunch, and then I'll eat supper. That's when the family's together. It might be just for a lunch. You know, you don't eat during lunch, and wherever you are, you use that time to pray to God instead. And so there's things you can do with eating, but also it may well be TV, it may well be internet or Facebook or some of the things that, again, that we like that aren't inherently bad in themselves. But take a break from it and say, God, I'm going to discipline myself, stay away from this thing that I like to do, you know, not a need like food, but I do like to do it to help discipline myself and maybe spend that time praying to you. So he does say, but when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face. Now, that definitely was a cultural thing. You don't have to put oil on your head. Washing your face is probably a good idea, but the oil on their head was how they would take care of their hair. They'd clean it, they'd comb it, it would stay, you know, neat that way. So what he's saying is don't make a show to other people. So that, and it says that, so that it won't be obvious to others that you are fasting, but only your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. So these three basic things Jesus talks about: giving to the needy, praying, and fasting. And from this, the first idea I want us to see today is we can choose who we live for. We can choose as disciples, as followers of God, who we live for. Are we going to live for others or for God? And when we say that, we're talking about, are we going to live for the attention of other people? Am I doing the things I do to be noticed by you and others? Because I want to receive some attention and praise from you. Well, God says that's totally possible, and there were plenty of people doing it, but look what it says over and over. It says that will be the only reward that you get. You'll get their praise, perhaps, but that's all. Again, and we might say, well, then who would do that? Well, look what it says in John chapter 12 there, the verses on your handout. Yet at the same time, many even among the leaders believed in Jesus. So this is later on in his ministry. But because of the Pharisees, they would not openly acknowledge their faith for fear they would be put out of the synagogue. And then look what it says. For they loved human praise more than praise from God. Saying there were people who would rather have the praise of men than the praise of God. And part of that, I think the praise of God is something definitely something that happens later. The well done, good and faithful servant. And like, I want it now, but it does show you it's possible. And if it's possible for them, it's possible for us to do things with a mindset and a focus on, I want some attention from people. That's really what I'm desiring. But then every time he says, on the other hand, if you do it for God, then you'll get his reward. And it doesn't tell us yet what that is. Passage, I think, as it unfolds, is going to tell us. But it says God will do something because you are focused on him. And really, this builds on what we saw that first week in the Sermon on the Mount. If we're truly doing these things from our heart, we're going to be focused from God. You're not doing it from your heart that's committed to God if you're looking for the attention of other people. But if you are focused on God, again, that's going to be what you're seeking. So it all builds on that. Now, in this passage, Jesus specifically mentions some things, godly things, praying, fasting, giving. I thought about it. Are there other applications, though? Are there other things that we do in life that maybe aren't specifically, church things, ministry things, whatever you want to say those are, that we do for the attention of other people? That we do to receive maybe the praise of people or the world, whether, again, the people might be Christians, might be non-Christians, and I think there are. I thought about some of our accomplishments. We do things, and why do we do them? It's not just because it's something we enjoy or something we want to make a mark or, something to contribute, but I want people to see, here's what I did. I want you to know, and I'm going to make sure you know, and, Sometimes our job in general can be like that. You know, we have this job, and it's not just, well, I need to provide, and it's not just, I want to contribute to society. I want everyone to know, here's what I do. Sometimes I think it might be our possessions. You know, there's things that we need to have, or it's nice to have, and there's nothing wrong with having, but do we get them because I want you to know what I've got, and how nice what I have is, and this and that. And again, there's nothing inherently wrong with any of these. There's nothing wrong with nice things. I thought about it, what about our looks? I'm glad we all combed our hair and got a little ready and stuff this morning, but I know it's possible in today's world that we're doing what we're doing because I want people to notice what I look like. I know it's possible in today's world. One thing that definitely comes up with all the social media is, friends. There's nothing wrong with having friends. One of the legs of the triangles is this idea of relationships with other Christians to encourage us. But nowadays, how many friends do I have on Facebook? How many people like this post? How many Instagram followers and all of these things? And I'm doing those because I want that attention. None of those are inherently bad, but I think we need to stop and think about, why do I do some of the things I do? And not just because it's right or wrong, but think about it. If you are focused on other people's attention, that means something in you is dependent upon someone else. The way I feel, whether it's my significance, my self-worth, my fulfillment, whatever, depends on other people, not on God. I'm at the mercy of other people. And I think that might be a clue to the reward, too. So let's look at the next section. Jesus talks about these things, and then he moves on, and he moves from who we focus on to more tangible things, starting at verse 19 there. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moths and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal." And that word, do not store up, it really can mean stop. So he's not just saying, hey, don't ever start this. He knows it's a common thing. People are doing it. Stop storing up treasures here on earth. Now, you have to realize whenever the Bible talks about anything, there's this idea of balance. This is not saying don't have a savings account. They're not saying we don't have a retirement fund and things like that. But it's saying don't make this your sole focus, that it's all about things here on earth, these treasures on earth. He says in verse 20, "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven where moths and vermin do not destroy and where thieves do not break in and steal." Again, in Jesus' day, they would store up these treasures. And for them, it may well be clothing. That's why he talks about the moths and stuff. A set of clothes was an important thing and something you could pass on. But he says, don't make that your whole focus, and realize just how susceptible it is. A moth gets in there, or mold or mildew, and it's gone. And even other things, jewels or gold that were more secure. Think about it in their houses. They lived in these mud-walled houses. It was pretty easy for someone to break in and steal it. There's no security there versus the things in heaven. And so the second key idea is we can choose what we live for. We can choose who we live for. Whose attention am I trying to get? We can also choose what. What is important to me? Treasure on earth or treasure in heaven? And again, these treasures on earth, when we talk about that, I think the real key that Jesus is focusing on, it's not just the things themselves, but it's these things as a source of security. I know that I'm going to be okay in life. Why? Well, because I've got this many sets of clothes, and I've got this much gold, and this much this. And they're saying, that's how I know. That's what I'm relying on in life. Jesus says, don't do that. I think you could also, as we apply this to ourselves, I think you could, apply it to maybe sources of pleasure. My treasure, my pleasure is this thing that's fleeting. I spend my time doing this, and it's sort of fun at the moment, but long term, is watching all that TV really, long-term, positive? No, it's as fleeting as some of the things Jesus was talking about. He says, instead, store up your treasures in heaven. Do things that have eternal significance. Do things that have an eternal focus, because that's what God made us for. And as disciples, that's what we should be focused on. And then he says the implication, verse 21, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Notice what he didn't say there. Do you see that? He didn't say where your heart is, there your treasure will be also. Now, is that true? Where your heart is, there your treasure will be. Is that true? Next answer? Maybe. Maybe. Go further. Yes, if your heart is somewhere, if you are committed to something, aren't you going to focus on that and put treasure there? Absolutely. He knows that, but his point is you can impact your heart. It's not just what you are committed to. You're going to then focus on that and put your treasure there. He's saying whatever you treasure, wherever you put your focus on treasure, it's going to impact your heart. It works both ways. And it'd be like, again, our heart is our general direction. Well, what he's saying is our specific daily choices impact our general direction, our general commitment to God. And it'd be the same thing if you were saying, hey, I'm headed north. That's my general direction. Well, what happens if along the way you take more turns that lead you south than turns that lead you north? Your general direction is really going to be south, isn't it? Those little choices you make. Well, same thing. The little choices we make in life about where I focus for my treasure, it's going to change my heart one way or the other. It's going to make me more committed to God or less committed to God. And so to strengthen our heart, we've got to make these God choices. We've got to focus on the things in life that have eternal significance. It doesn't mean we never do anything that's just for the moment. You know, I'm going to watch some football this afternoon. It really has no eternal significance, you know, other than maybe watching it with some good friends. But other than that, but don't make the focus of your life these things that at the end they have no meaningful and lasting value. He goes on, He's still in the same subject here, and he transfers his metaphor. Verse 22, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? You know, what he's saying here is it makes sense. You know, how do you know if a light is on in a room? You can see it or not. You know, unless the light is so strong that it's just emitting heat. The only way you know is your eye. The light comes into your body through the eye. Well, he's saying here, he uses that thought, and he says, if your eyes are healthy, and some translations say clear, in other words, if they're focused on the right thing, and they're able to let that light in, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes aren't, if you're focused, if you're not able to focus on the right thing, if you're not focusing on the right thing, your whole body's going to be full of darkness. And the point is, our focus, earthly or heavenly treasure, physical or spiritual, it's going to impact our life. And again, I think this is tying into what's this reward God wants to give us? Well, it's going to be impacted by where we focus. And this has to be, as you think about it, isn't this like one of the most obvious things? It's like, of course, what I focus on in life is going to impact my life. But at the same time, how many of us try to ignore that? How many of us say, you know what, God, I love you and I'm focused on you, but we spend time doing these other things and think it won't matter? And again, it's not things just in general. It's not things just like here and there, but the focus of our life. We say, yeah, I want to call myself a Christian. I want to call myself a disciple, but I'm going to put my focus here. Do we really think it won't impact things? Again, it's like making a bunch of south turns saying I'm headed north. It's not going to work. And that's what Jesus says. Whatever we focus on, it's going to impact our body, our life, one way or the other. And then he says the last thing in this section. He says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. You know, you can have two jobs. Some of us maybe have had two jobs or three jobs at a time. But you can't have two masters. You know, a master by its very definition, it's all-encompassing. You only have one master. Now, Jesus takes that principle and then he twists it a little different, because usually it would be, you know, you can't serve two masters. You know, they won't want you to. I want you full time. But he takes that thought and then he uses it for us. He says, if you would try to, and that's what we try to do in life, he says you're going to compare them and you're going to really gravitate toward one versus the other. You're going to hate one, despise the other. You're going to not be faithful to one, be faithful to the other. And he's talking about us again. Like, what do we do in life? What do we do? Who is our master? Who is in control of our life? And he specifically says, you cannot serve both God and money. Trying to compete with a cat. That's pretty tough. Darren and Grace, sometimes trying to compete with kids is tough too. Thank you. You can't serve both God and money. And, you know, where's money come from? He hasn't been talking about it, but think of all these earthly treasures. They all take money. You know, and it's the source of our security. Even back then, my set of clothes, my gold, my whatever, it all took money. He says you can't have both of them as your master. And that word, and if you're used to like the old King James, you can't serve God and mammon. You always wonder, what in the world is mammon? And it's translated in the newer ones, money. Well, it's really not just money. You know, whatever that mammon word meant, it had this idea that it's what you rely on for your security. I mean, it's exactly what Jesus is talking about here in the bigger picture. You can't serve God and say, God, I'm relying on you, but then also, yeah, but just in case, I got this. No, we either rely on God or we don't. Again, it doesn't mean we don't have a savings account. Proverbs talks about being thrifty and all those things. But when it comes down to it, who do I trust in life? What am I relying on? And again, it goes back to this reward. If we are trusting in earthly things, we miss out on the reward. Look at the last thing he says. Here's where he really reveals what this reward is. Verse 25, he says, therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or about your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and the body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? No, he can take some off. And he says, and why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin, yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these flowers. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? And the third idea that I want us to see today is we can choose how we live. And this is where the reward comes into play. We can choose whether we're going to live with worry or not. And you might have seen that at first and thought, well, this is the wait a minute moment of the passage, because Jesus says, do not worry about life. Is it that easy? No. Yeah, there's like the wait. Like Jesus just says, don't worry, like it's something I can control. But I've known this for a long time. I've tried not to worry, and usually when I try not to worry, I worry more. Yeah. So what's the deal, Jesus? Because notice he doesn't say, hey, if you would like to not worry, here's a plan of action I'd encourage you to take. And notice he says, don't worry. It's an instruction. And when Jesus gives an instruction, you could almost call it a command. Yeah. He says, don't worry. How does he expect us to not worry? Well, what's that word worry mean? You know, I think it has a couple meanings. And the first thing, and it's what he's focusing on here, you know, worry sometimes is a matter of our actions, isn't it? You know, if someone comes over to your house unexpected and things are a little messy and you start cleaning up, and what do they say? Don't worry about doing that. They're specifically talking about your actions. They're not talking about your state of mind. They're saying don't do those things. You don't have to do those things. Well, that's what Jesus is saying here. When he says don't worry, he's saying don't do things that equal worry. What kind of things? Well, it's just what we saw. This is picking up. It's why it says therefore. Whenever you see therefore, what? Ask what it's there for. You go back to what was before. And so you go back to like verses like 19 and 20. Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Quit doing it. That equals worry. You know, he says, no one can serve two masters. Quit trying to. That equals worry. And I'm telling you, don't do it. And so there's that element of an action. Don't do these things that equal worrying. And we can control our actions, can't we? We may not like to. It may be tough to do, but we can do that. And so Jesus says don't do it. And then he even says why. And he gives a couple good reasons. You know, it makes no sense to worry. He says, one, there's no reason because God will provide for your needs. And he gives a couple great examples. He says, look around at the birds. You know, they don't plant seeds. They don't have tractors to go harvest the seed, but they got all the food they need. God takes care of them. Look at the flowers. They don't sow their own, you know, adornments, but they're more beautiful than Solomon was in all his clothes. You know, and there's obviously a balance here. God's not saying don't do anything. The Bible over and over. There's a place in the Bible that says if you don't work, you don't eat. But he's saying, don't worry about these things. Don't make that thinking that it all depends on me and my efforts. And why is that? Well, because the point is, God cares for the birds. He cares for the flowers. Don't you think he cares for you even more? He sent his son to die for you. And you're worried about the things that birds and flowers don't even worry about? So there's no reason. And then second thing, why don't worry, is there's no use to worrying. You know, our worrying actions can't control anything. And he makes a specific point. Can they add an hour to your life? Now, nowadays, I think we have the ability to add a little time to our life more than they did because their diet was pretty well set and they didn't need to exercise. They didn't sit around all day. And so we can control our diet and we can control exercise. So there is an element where this is a little different for us. There's another way to translate this that talks about can you add some inches to your height? And there's one that, continues like, you can't do that either. But, well, there might be some little things there. Okay, some little differences. The point is, we can impact things. We can't control things, can we? We can never absolutely control things, but God can. So why would you think it all depends on me when I'm not in control versus we could depend on God and He's totally in control? That's what He's saying here. And we look at our life in so many situations, just remember, there's no reason to worry. God loves me more than He loves all the other things He cares for. And it doesn't do any good to worry. Now, the other side of worry, again, worry is an action, but worry is also an emotion. Isn't there a side of worry that's like, okay, I can't control it. I have this feeling, I'm in this situation, and I know the Bible says don't worry, but I do. We can impact that as well. We can't control our emotions, but you know what we can control? The things that we just saw. You can control who you live for. And you can control what you live for. And this last section builds upon the first two. Jesus is saying, if you are living for the attention of the world, guess what? You'll always be worrying about how the world interacts with you and responds to you. And if you are living for the treasures of the earth, guess what? You'll always be worrying about, are they going to get stolen? Are they going to rust? Are they going to die off? It's impossible. You can't separate the two. And here's the thing that many people try to do. We try to separate them. We try to say, God, I'm going to live for the attention of people. We probably don't tell God that. We just live for the attention of people. We live for the treasures of earth. And then we get in the middle of a difficult situation like, oh, God, please help me not worry. Well, we've set a path of worrying in every other part of our life. They go together. We control whether we worry or not based on what we do in these other situations. And that's why Jesus says in verse 31, so do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows you need them. God's in control here. And then the culminating verse, but seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. It's not just don't worry and then just be neutral. He says, but seek first God's kingdom. What's God's kingdom? It's the realm of His authority. In other words, seek to be in it. God, I want to be your disciple. I want to be your follower. Seek to submit to it and seek to spread it. God, that's what I want with my life, that you, more and more people would come to know you. And seek first His righteousness, these principles for living. God, I want to live by your principles. And then what's it say here? It says all these things will be added to you as well. What things? I mean, that should get our attention. All these things are going to be mine if I do that. Wow, here's the magic formula. Forget the prayer of Jabez. It's right here in the open in one of the most well-known sermons of the Bible. You seek first God's kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. Well, He's just talked about earthly treasures. So can we expect every earthly treasure? Hasn't happened yet that I've seen. But you know what? If someone's seeking an earthly treasure, do they really want that thing? Do they really want that? Is it the material objects themselves? It's what they give us, isn't it? I want this thing. Why? Because it gives me security. I want a big bank account so I know I'll be taken care of in life. Well, how'd that work when the stock market collapsed and other things? I want this thing, this possession. Why? So other people will look at me and I'll have significance. Wow, he's someone who has that. I want it so I'll have, as well some satisfaction. So it's not the things we want, it's what they bring. Well, Jesus is saying here, if you seek first God, you'll get the satisfaction, you'll get the significance, you'll get the security from Him, the way it's supposed to come. And then he finishes up the last verse, and I thought this was weird. To me, it was almost like anticlimactic. Like verse 33 is the major verse. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. And then he tags this on at the end. He says, therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And as I read, one of the commentators said, Jesus just made this grand theological statement, and then he says, I need to maybe finish this off with something just down to earth and practical. And so that's what he does. He says, don't worry about tomorrow. Now notice what he didn't say. He didn't say don't worry about today. Does that mean that we can worry about today? That's fair game? No, the problem is, and today doesn't mean necessarily this 24-hour period. It means right now. And he didn't have to say don't worry about right now, because what's the difference between worry and I guess you'd say just caution and diligence or whatever? If you're in an immediate situation, if you wake up in the middle of the night and you smell smoke, are you worrying if you check it out and maybe get your family out of the house? No, that's just diligence, caution. That's the right response. Worry is something that, just as he says, deals with the future. Don't worry about today, what's going on right now. He doesn't even say that. Don't worry about tomorrow. And that's what our worry is. It's not what is, it's what if, isn't it? What if this happens? What if that happens? I shared the thing from a book that I read a while ago, and it's been a little mantra that's gotten Lisa and I through quite a few situations. It's a story, sort of a novel about this guy he's out of work and he's got these bills, and he has this Christian mentor figure. And the person who's out of work and struggling, he was really having a tough day that day. And the mentor comes to him and says, do you have enough money for today? He says, yeah, I'm doing okay today, but I got this bill due next week. And the mentor just keeps saying, do you have enough for today? Well, yeah, I'm all right today, but, in 2 weeks, then my car payment. Do you have enough for today? Yeah, I'm okay now, but... And it finally sinks in. Do you have enough for today? Do you have enough for right now? That's what's important. And for all the things that we've faced lately, the past several years, there's never been a time when we didn't have enough for right now. Sometimes what we had was $2, literally. But that's all we needed right then. We've always had enough for today, and God provided then the next day what was needed that day. And that's the source here. He says, don't worry about tomorrow. Don't ask the what if question. Ask the what is question. What do I have enough right now? And it leads into the last thing this morning. Again, in any of these Bible passages, there's an underlying issue. Because it's not just like, okay, get these facts and now we can all run out of here and we're good. There's always something that says, yeah, but. That's what I should call it, the yeah, but moment. I get all this, but. And it comes out in verse 30. It says, if this is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? Notice he hasn't mentioned faith prior to this. Matter of fact, it doesn't come up in the entire book of Matthew until now. Where's it come from? Well, this is what we're doing. If we're doing all these other things, we're worrying and we don't have faith. We don't trust God. We're not trusting God for provision, even though we look and he's taking care of the birds and the flowers, but we're like, oh, I wonder if he'll take care of me. We're not relying on God versus ourselves, even though when we look at the big picture, God is way more reliable than I am, even for myself. Which right there is another thing. Every time the idea of faith comes up, what do we often hear in the world today? Faith is the opposite of reason. These examples show us that faith is entirely reasonable. It makes more sense to depend on God than depend on myself. Makes more sense to trust he's going to take care of me because he takes care of the birds and the flowers. And go back even to these first things. When we are living for other people's attention, are we trusting God? No, we're saying, God, I won't be happy. I won't be satisfied and fulfilled unless that person notices what I do. And when we focus on earthly treasures, are we trusting God? No, we're saying, God, I'm not sure if you're going to come through for me, so I'm going to have so much build up that there's no way that I can't get through life, even if you fail me. That's really what we're saying. And the opposite of that then is trusting God. And again, you can't just apply it to provision. You can't just wait till you're in the middle of a situation and never trust God for who you live for and what you live for, and then get in a tough time and say, God, I'm trusting you and I'm trying not to worry, and boy, it's not working. We've got to practice it all the time. And how do we do that? What's the last thing this morning? What do I need to do? A few questions I put there. First of all, what am I seeking first? And notice that answer first. So often we want to say, are you seeking God? Well, of course I'm seeking God. Yeah, but what are you seeking first? Again, going home this afternoon and watching a football game, there's nothing inherently wrong. But if I'm seeking a football game first, that's when it becomes a problem. And anything else in my life that I put before God, what am I seeking first? And then the second question, what would trusting God more look like? I thought about that. We all trust God some, but if in my life, if I were to trust God a little more, how would that change things? How would that change things? What's it look like? And then the last question is just what needs to happen for that to take place. For me to live a life that trusts God a little more, what do I need to change? And I don't know what situation is in your mind. Maybe it's something with finances. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe it's, parenting. Maybe it's kids to parents. I don't know. What do I need to do? And then what will it look like? I always like to see, and because it's usually right there in the passage, it says, it gives us hope. If you do this, here's what's going to happen. It's not a mystery. Verse 33, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. We are seeking significance in life. We are seeking security. We are seeking satisfaction. You know what? God made us that way. It's not a surprise to him. It's not like that came along and said, boy, I never knew these humans were going to just be so focused on satisfaction and security and significance. No, he knew it. But God says, I've got the way to take care of it. I've got the only way that truly works. If you seek me first, you're going to get those things. You're going to experience those things. And so, as we've been doing, and I thought this one, at least it came to me pretty quick. Sometimes the discussion question isn't as obvious, but this one, I thought about it. Why do we have so much trouble doing what makes so much sense to do? Doesn't it make sense to trust God instead of me, to realize he's in control and I never can be and never will be? It makes so much sense, but unless you're different than me, I still struggle with it. Why do we have so much trouble doing what makes so much sense to do?